everyone.
Hi.
Welcome to the 2020 International eConference on Interreligious Dialogue. My name is Dr. Darren Slade, and I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, which is hosting this year's academic conference. Now, one of the great things about GCRR is that you can attend these academic conferences right from the comfort and safety of your own home without having to worry about hotel fees and travel costs. In fact, you're being joined right now by students, scholars, and specialists from all over the world. And because each of these presentations are video recorded, the information presented here will be available all across the globe for millions of people to see. Now, for those attending live, as you listen to each presentation, feel free to hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and our speaker will do their best to answer them at the end of the presentation. And with that said, I'd like to introduce you to my very good friend and the next presenter, Dominic McGann. And allow me to share my screen so I can give a proper introduction. All right, Dominic McGann today is going to be discussing Understanding, the foundation of interreligious dialogue. Now, he is a probationary research student in theology and religion at the University of Oxford, who's studying under Dr. Andrew Pinson. And for those who don't know, in layman's term, a probationary research student basically means you're a PhD student, you're a doctoral student. His research deals with the foundational aspects of religion and science in an effort to demonstrate their similarity as intellectual fields, and is funded by the Arthur Peacock Graduate Studentship in Theology at Oxford's Exeter College. Now, he focuses on a philosophy of understanding and applying this philosophy to the ways in which we understand the divine. So we're lucky to have him here. Thank you so much for doing this, Mr. McGann. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and in such a novel format, given the current global situation. But I very much enjoy anything which tries to innovate in the academic field. So I think this is very good. Allow me to just share my screen for a moment, and I will be with you. There we go. Brilliant. So as has already been said, I am going to present today on understanding. As I see understanding to be the foundation of this conference's theme of interreligious dialogue. As has already been stated, my name is Dominic McGann. It's a pleasure to meet you. I am a research student here at Oxford, currently studying for my DPhil, which is the fancy word for PhD, because Oxford likes to be different to other institutions, and we just have to give them that. I am currently in the process of my first year, having already done a 2-year research program previously with my same academic supervisor, Dr. Andrew Pinson. I'm working out of or in association with the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion, which is attached to Oxford's Department of Theology and Religion. And I'm currently studying understanding, what it means to understand, and its relationship to the divine, such as how we understand God. Specifically, as we all know, doctoral theses have a much more targeted title often. I'm looking into how sacred music can invoke an understanding of God in various different religions, and also looking into elements relating to science and the science of relating to other people in a group setting. I wanted to talk to you today about understanding because I see it as being of crucial importance if we are going to talk about interreligious dialogue. If we want to establish a successful interreligious dialogue, then I believe it is necessary for us to first understand what it means to understand the world in a religious way. Surely the purpose of an interreligious dialogue is in a cross-pollination, if you will, a mixing of understandings from different perspectives. And if we want to start that cross-pollination in order to generate new understandings, new theories about the world, then, well, we better know what it means to understand the world at all. That seems like the preliminary step. However, unfortunately, this is somewhat understudied. I say unfortunately, perhaps that's fortunate for me and my research, as I get to be one of the people trying to start studying it. But there is a distinct lack of studies into the nature of understanding. Most interestingly, I think, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the great resource with which many people are familiar, I'm sure, which is in many ways a resource intended to increase understanding of philosophy worldwide, has no article on understanding itself, which I find to be very ironic, given its set purpose. So this is a new and understudied field, I believe. It has been mentioned by many scholars, but never delved into as a subject in its own right. So I am going to attempt to start clearing those muddy waters up a little bit today. And so here is my presentation structure, briefly put. So I'm going to start by explaining my particular window into the philosophy of understanding, how I came to the study through my studies into Kuhn's work as it relates to religion. I'm then going to lay out and explain in the bulk of my presentation three aspects of understanding, which I believe make it a distinct mental attitude. And then third, I'm going to end with a brief summary ahead of a Q&A session, which will follow my presentation. So to get started on that, let's talk briefly about my last 2 years of research working on Kuhnian paradigms and their relationship to the philosophy of religion and religions in general. So Thomas Kuhn, as some of you may well be aware, is a philosopher of science who wrote a philosophical history of scientific theory change, the ways in which theories change, the mechanisms that bring about those changes. And he looked in a very historical way at the actual progression of theories in sciences such as chemistry and astronomy, and looked into how they evolved. Broadly speaking, he believed that they evolved by a system of revolutionary change that involves a leapfrogging between different paradigms. Now, a paradigm is a technical piece of terminology that Kuhn uses, and the definition is notably vague across literature. And one of my challenges during these 2 years of research was to try and pin down precisely what Kuhn meant by a paradigm. He uses the word a lot in many of his books, but never goes out and out and says, this is what a paradigm is. He kind of implies it. So vague is his work on defining paradigms, in fact, that he wrote his famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in the early 60s, and then spent the remainder of his career until the early 2000s trying to clarify mistakes or misapprehensions of his theory that were due to this lack of clarity. Roughly speaking, for our purposes and my purposes in research, I believe we can define a paradigm as an interpretation of reality made up of a subscription to a collection of theories about a phenomenon or group of phenomena. What this means is that paradigms involve a take on the world, your interpretation of what reality is. Crucially for Kuhn, this involves a worldview, quite literally your view on the world. Now, Kuhn belabors this point over and over again and treats it with a great severity and sincerity in his work. So it is a very technical terminology, which is perhaps best understood by consulting the analogies that Kuhn himself used. So let's look at this example, which Kuhn is very famous for, which is comparing Copernican and Ptolemaic astronomy. Copernican astronomy, for those who don't know, is that astronomy which we currently subscribe to generally, which says that the Earth orbits around the sun, as do the other bodies in our solar system. Ptolemaic astronomy, on the other hand, is the ancient Greek model wherein the celestial bodies, the planets and the sun and the moon, all orbit around a stationary Earth. So Kuhn uses this as a window into explaining what a paradigm is and what it means scientifically. To explain this, let's consider an analogy, consider an example. Consider that there are two people watching a sunrise, and one of those persons is a Copernican astronomer and the other a Ptolemaic astronomer. Now, Kuhn's work on paradigms states that as both of these astronomers have different paradigms scientifically that they subscribe to, both of them have different worldviews. And that means that both of them have a different subjective interpretation of the same objective phenomenon. So a sunrise, for example, when a Ptolemaic astronomer looks at a sunrise, they see quite literally a sun rising. They see the sun moving around the stationary Earth, rising seemingly above our horizons. On the other hand, the Copernican astronomer still uses the word sunrise, though for them it's a dead metaphor. They know that the sun doesn't rise, but this is in fact an optical illusion caused by the Earth's rotation on its axis. What this means then is that we have here two rational people with different scientific theories, both looking at the same objective phenomenon. But due to their pre-apprehensions about the nature of reality, they are experiencing this phenomenon in a subjectively different way. And that is what Kuhn calls a worldview. This talk of worldviews and paradigms is very interesting, but natively very much bound to Kuhn's work. And after finishing my work on Kuhn, I sought to maybe expand elements of what Kuhn was saying about worldviews to a more general theory of what it is to understand the world. So for our purposes going forward in this talk, I believe we can abandon the use of the word worldview and paradigm and focus instead on the more commonplace term of understanding, or to understand the world. Now, for the remainder of this talk, I want to present three features of understanding. in a quest, of course, to understand understanding or begin understanding understanding, in order to develop a foundation of what I believe a healthy interreligious dialogue needs to have, a knowledge of what it is we are trying to give each other, different understandings. So the first key feature I wish to talk about is the one I will spend the most time talking about. And that is this subjective nature of understanding, that which is alluded to quite heavily in Kuhn's work on worldviews and paradigms. But I will present to you an example, which will hopefully de-science that idea, to take it away from the very specific history of science view that Thomas Kuhn was taking and put it into a more generally applicable philosophical methodology. The second key feature of understanding I wish to cover is that understanding is not concerned with an appreciation of small parts of a theory or a phenomenon, but the whole phenomenon or field itself. It is not concerned with the bricks that make the house, but with the house itself, if you will. And finally, the third key feature of understanding is I believe understanding is an internal mental state that must exist within one's mind and cannot be outsourced to other areas of our surroundings, be that a book or the internet, for example. So to get us started on a conversation about the key features of understanding, I will linger a little while on this point about subjectivity. So in understanding, we want to find a definition. And an important part of any definition is distinguishing a concept such as understanding from similar concepts. Understanding is what I refer to as a mental attitude. You are in a state of understanding, just as you can be in a state of belief or a state of knowledge. It is an attitude you adopt towards a particular fact about the world. So in the study of the philosophy of mind and epistemology, the chief mental attitude, the one that everyone wants to understand finally, to finally clarify, is knowledge. That is the mental attitude that is most studied. So for the purposes of me pointing out these key features, I'm pointing them out specifically with the purpose of defining them as being different from knowledge. So this subjectivity of understanding is important in that regard, because knowledge, unlike understanding, deals with the objective reality. Knowledge is based in, well, at least our best running theory of what knowledge is what is referred to as the tripartite thesis. That is that knowledge is a justified true belief about the world. In order to know something, I have to have a belief in it that is justified by evidence or experience, and that belief has to turn out to be true. I can't know something that is actually false. For example, I might believe that the moon is made of cheese, but I cannot know that the moon is made of cheese, because of course that is not the case. So knowledge in this way is intrinsically linked to the objective, but understanding, I believe, is linked to the subjective, as is alluded to by Kuhn's worldviews. Let's consider this drawing. This is a famous drawing, one that many of you may have come across before. It is Wittgenstein's duck rabbit, or at least an iteration of the duck rabbit. Now, I love this drawing. I use it all the time because I believe it really highlights the subjectivity of understanding in many ways. This is a single drawing, and that drawing can be interpreted, unlike a lot of other drawings, in two distinct ways. It can either be seen as a clear picture of a duck facing left, or as a clear picture of a rabbit facing right. This image, the duck rabbit, is intriguing for just that reason. It is a single drawing that contains two completely disparate images within the same lines, within the same sketches on a piece of paper. And that, for me, illustrates the difference between knowledge and understanding. Taken in an objective sense, what is this drawing? Well, it's a series of lines on paper in a particular form. On a subjective level, when it comes to interpretation, we can take that static, unchanging objective drawing and subjectively interpret it in two different ways, or if we wish, subjectively understand it in two different ways. We can understand it as a duck or understand it as a rabbit. This whole time, the objective data in front of us, this drawing, does not change. What changes is the way we understand this object. And that, I believe, is really gets at the point of understanding. Whereas knowledge is concerned with knowing the drawing in terms of being able to copy it, for example, being able to sketch it out, or being able to describe it maybe to someone who is sketching it out. Understanding is different. Understanding goes beyond the objective fact about the drawing, its size, and goes into our minds. It is to do with our own view on the world. The best way of illustrating this, perhaps, is to take another analogy. Consider, again, that there are two people staring, except rather than staring at a sunrise, they're staring at the duck rabbit. And rather than being astronomers, these two people come from two different islands. One is called Duck Island, and the other is called Rabbit Island. Now, on Duck Island, there are no rabbits. There are only ducks. And on Rabbit Island, there are no ducks. There are only rabbits. These two people look at the drawing and are both asked to tell us what they see. The Duck Islander says, well, that's a drawing of a duck. And the Rabbit Islander says, well, that's a drawing of a rabbit. Of course, the Duck Islander can't see it as a rabbit, and the Rabbit Islander can't possibly see it as a duck, because they don't know what those animals are. They have never experienced them. And so, even though the drawing changes, the drawing doesn't change, rather. What is changing is their subjective understanding of the world and how that informs how they look at the drawing. They can't see what is there other than what is informed by their subjective knowledge that already exists about the world. Were it to be intrinsically based upon the objective reality as knowledge is, then this change in interpretation between the two viewers, one person only seeing it as a duck and one only seeing it as a rabbit, would require an alteration in the drawing. But we do not see this. The drawing stays the same, and two perfectly rational people see it as two distinct things because of their different understandings of what exists in reality. I find the subjectivity of understanding to be of particular interest for our purposes here. If our understanding of the world is so heavily linked to our subjective experience of it, then we have to consider how it is we are to teach. If I want to confer to you some understanding that I have about the world, then if it is subjectively laden, as I believe understanding to be, it cannot be transferred directly. It cannot be injected directly into your brain and into your conscious experience. Instead, I have to do something far clever, something which teachers are adept at, which is finding out ways of catalyzing similar insights or active understanding in others' minds. Doing things like I just did with the analogy of the duck person and the rabbit person. We have to come up with clever mental gymnastics to be able to create in someone's brain the understanding we're trying to get across, in the knowledge that if understanding is subjective, we can't just hand it to them. This is, of course, very important for the purpose of interreligious dialogue. If people are coming at a problem from two different religious angles, then we need to find a common teaching ground by which we can catalyze this subjective or similar subjective understanding within the mind of someone who might come from a completely different subjective experience of the world. So that about wraps up what I want to say about the subjectivity of understanding. And I have belabored that point a fair bit, but that is because I believe it to be truly the most unique and stunning part of what separates understanding from other mental attitudes. I will mention two other attributes of understanding, however, that of an understanding of the whole and that of understanding as being an internal mental attitude. And for that, I will start by talking of the etymology of the word understanding. So understanding, in its current English sort of phrase, comes from the Old English atoms of under and standen. Under means roughly the same as it means today, under. It means to be underneath something or below it. Standen as an atom is slightly more complex. It is equivalent to the verb to stand, but specifically in the context of being in or amongst something. So you stand in a crowd or in a river. Both of these etymological atoms of understanding, I believe, can shed some light on the nature of understanding, specifically in relation to the second attribute of an understanding of the whole. First, let's consider under, the easier of the two etymological atoms to get our heads around. This conjures up an image in our mind, a metaphor, if you will. Metaphors are very important for understanding as they do the thing I was just talking about with subjectivity. They allow us to bridge the gap between subjective understandings. So consider the metaphor raised by under. It brings to mind this idea of gathering individual things together under a particular heading. It stands under something, quite literally, like people huddling under an umbrella in the rain. This, I believe, relates to understanding very deeply, because to understand something is not just to know the individual facts, but to gather them together in a single intellectual system. Copernican astronomy, which says that planets orbit around the sun, is not a single theory. It is a collection of multiple theories that are ever complex, to do with optics and how we view planets, to do with angular motion, the motion of three-bodied systems, a physical problem so difficult that Isaac Newton could not figure it out. All of these things are involved in Copernican astronomy. It's not just one idea. It's the gathering together of many ideas under a single heading, Copernican astronomy. So this, I think, is what can be gained from the first etymological atom, this idea of gathering together ideas and forming a single understanding. The second etymological atom is perhaps more complex and requires a little bit more of an analogy to make the point I'm trying to make. Standan, as I've said, is the verb to stand in the context of being in or amongst something. When relating to ideas, it gives us the idea of existing within an idea, not admiring its parts, but understanding it as a whole, not looking at the individual facts, but the connections between them. Again, how they relate as an interconnected body. To say you understand a person, you might understand your spouse or your partner. It's not simply to know how they react to certain situations. It's to understand the connections between those reactions, to understand them as a person, their background, their history, the traumas they might have that might inform how they act. Understanding is not a case of simply dealing with individual ideas. It is being within those ideas, seeing them as the whole they are. I find that a good way of clarifying this point is with the analogy of art and considering or admiring a painting. I believe you can know a painting by studying its brushstrokes and its pigments. Just how you could recreate the duck rabbit drawing if you knew how to draw it, if you could make those lines on a paper, you can know a painting by being able to replicate it or being able to tell me facts about it when it was made, perhaps. The pigments used, how hard those pigments were to find in the era that it was painted. To understand a painting, however, is something different. It requires a stepping back, an admiration of that piece of art, appreciating it not simply as marks on paper, but as a whole artistic object with a history, a provenance, an artist who may have had different inspirations and suffered and lived in different ways. And you have to understand how that informs a painting as well, as any art historian will tell you, I'm sure. I think a stark example of that exists in Hans Holbein's The Ambassadors. Now, this is a painting which, for all intents and purposes, is fairly mundane. The colors are rich. It shows two fairly bored-looking ambassadors, I'm assuming, or political folks. And if you admired it simply for what you could know about the painting, its pigments, its subjects, its painter, and its date, it would remain that. It would remain mundane, fairly uninteresting. But if you considered it as a whole, you considered the purpose for which Holbein painted it, and you physically step back from the painting and look at it from an angle, you will see the smudge that stands at the ambassador's feet is actually a skull when viewed from the correct angle, and memento mori carrying a darker message within the painting. To understand this work of art, then, is not simply to know its individual parts, but appreciate it as a whole in the context of what was intended for it, and appreciate it physically in the gallery as a whole painting from a distance, from a particular angle. This lengthy analogy is for the purpose of explaining this characteristic of understanding, where it differs from knowledge in the sense of not being so worried about the fine grains of the world. Philosophers will happily talk about propositions until the cows come home, but understanding is different from that. It doesn't see the world in an atomistic, broken down way. It sees it as a network of connected ideas, which, when brought together, have a particular purpose. And this, I believe, it's a very important thing to remember about understanding, and especially in today's philosophical world in which knowledge and fine-grained and logic is so highly prized, sometimes considering the power of understanding as a whole in the world is quite important, I think. This brings us finally to my third and final aspect of understanding that I wish to talk about today. And that is the internality of understanding. So when I talk about understanding being a mental attitude, I mean it is an internal mental attitude. Now, what does it mean to be an internal mental attitude? Well, I believe it means it is an attitude of the mind, such as knowledge or belief. But unlike knowledge or belief, it doesn't necessarily have the ability to be outsourced to an external source of information. We talk often about the corpus of human knowledge in archives, the internet, encyclopedias, dictionaries of different languages. We have gathered on paper and in digital form everything that humanity knows so far, and finding it is not hard. So much so that a couple of academics I've come across dealing with the information age as it is currently known, say, come up with something like an extended mind. Our knowledge of the world is no longer limited to just what's in our head. We have knowledge at our fingertips, we say. And that means, of course, it implies that that knowledge is external to our body. Understanding, however, I don't think it has that same capability. Unlike knowledge, which can be outsourced and at our fingertips away from our brain, to understand something means to make it a part of your brain. It involves a processing of knowledge internally so that you can carry that with you. This remains ever poignant, I think, in the age when such information is at our fingertips. And it is far too easy for people to parrot the understandings of others without taking time to understand it themselves. To illustrate this, I have two further analogies before I finish my presentation, both of which come from the philosophy of mind, and relate to computer intelligence initially, but I believe they can be repurposed for my purposes here. The first is Searle's Chinese room. Now, this is an analogy, a thought experiment, intended to demonstrate the inability of computers to think like humans. But I will segue this into demonstrating the internality of understanding. To explain the analogy, there is a room, and this room is miraculous. It is a room with an input slot and an output slot. And if you put a paper containing a question written in Mandarin characters into the input slot, a few minutes will go by, and the correct answer to that question, it could be the distance from Earth to the moon, for example, will come out of the output slot. This seems miraculous to those who use it, but they don't know what's inside the box. Inside the box, there is a large table, and on that large table, there is a large book, which is labeled the rules ledger. And a person sits at this table called the operator. Now, when a question in Chinese, in Mandarin, comes through the input slot, the operator looks at it and opens their rules ledger and finds inside the rules ledger a syntactic description of every character in the Mandarin language and the order it comes in. And using that, he can manipulate these symbols to find algorithmically the correct answer to the question based purely upon the shape and the order of these characters on the page. He then, after following the algorithms written in the rules ledger laboriously, this book you would have to imagine would be thousands and thousands of pages long, he writes down the characters that the book tells him to write down in response to that question, and he posts the paper through the output slot. And people on the outside of the room are wowed by how intelligent this room seems to be in its ability to answer questions so well. Something is important here, though. If I were to ask you the question, does the operator understand Mandarin? It seems that the answer would be no. The operator understands something very crucial. He understands and knows how to use the rules ledger effectively. He probably has certain pages memorized where, symbols that keep coming up can be found and located. But the operator, crucially to Searle's experiments, doesn't understand a word of Mandarin Chinese. He is operating entirely off the back of the algorithmic rules based on the shape and order of the symbols written in the rules ledger. Searle makes the point that the operator doesn't truly understand Chinese, and he uses that to show how computers, which work by manipulating data in a syntactic way based on the order of ones and zeros in binary, don't really understand the world. But the question to me is, well, why does the computer not understand? I agree with Searle, but want to find the reason why. And I think that reason is because Searle's operator in the room does not understand Mandarin Chinese. He is reliant on that ledger. He's reliant upon the information passed to him by the book, such that if he took that book away, suddenly the room ceases to function as a translating machine, as something that can answer questions. This, I believe, demonstrates one case of demonstrating the internality of understanding. The fact that understanding can't exist outside your brain. Some might be tempted to say that this rules ledger is an external understanding of Mandarin, but really it seems like it's not at all. We can't say in any realistic way that the operator understands Mandarin. The second case from the philosophy of mind I wish to talk about is the classic case of Mary in the black and white room, which is used for a similar purpose of demonstrating how machines might understand the world. Well, they are not able to understand the world, how humans do. In this case, imagine there is a girl who has been raised in a room where everything is black and white. Special lights are fitted in the ceiling, perhaps, that block out all colorful wavelengths of light. So this girl grows up entirely in grayscale. When this girl becomes older, she becomes fascinated by physics. She starts studying optics and the physics of light, and soon she becomes an expert in color, despite living in a black and white room. She knows everything there is to know about the different wavelengths of light, what colors they produce in the human mind, how the operation of the eye functions in the human biology. Everything you can think about color, she knows. One day, miraculously, when she wakes up in her black and white bed, the black and white door to her black and white room is open. And standing at the other end is a man holding a red apple. For the first time in Mary's life, though she knew what red was, she knew the science of it, she sees she sees a red apple for the first time and gains an understanding of it. This Frank Jackson's analogy here, I think, demonstrates another aspect of the internality of understanding. Mary knew everything there was to know about color externally. She knew the science of color like the back of her hand and could have answered any question on the physics of color absolutely perfectly, possibly the best in the world. But she could not have answered the question, what did red look like? Until she saw the apple, she didn't understand red. That knowledge of the color of the fruit was not part of her brain. She just knew what it was supposed to look like, how other humans saw it according to scientific studies. But it wasn't until that external knowledge became internal to her mind and she herself gained the experience of seeing a red apple that she comes to truly understand color. And this is another aspect of the internality of understanding. Understanding, unlike knowledge, is an internal state. It doesn't matter how much you know, you cannot understand something unless you process that knowledge and affix it within your brain. That ends my talk on the various elements of understanding. And just to summarize before we move to a Q&A session, I said that understanding is of crucial importance as it is the foundation of useful interreligious dialogue. This area, however, is sadly understudied, though it's touched upon by many theorists, I believe, such as Thomas Kuhn. I've also argued that understanding has three key features that in combination distinguish it from other mental attributes, chiefly knowledge, this king of mental attributes that is focused on so much in philosophy. These three characteristics of understanding as a mental attitude are that understanding is subjective insofar as it does not depend on objective truths. Understanding concerns wholes and not their individual parts. And finally, understanding is an internal mental state and can't be outsourced to external sources, persons, entities, etc. That ends my talk. I believe we're going to go to a Q&A session now. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful, Mr. McGann. Thank you so much for doing that. I think what's important about your discussion is just how complex and nuanced the entire field of study is, but also just how we want to say maybe nascent the study is, that it's not as explored as it should be in terms of the cognitive sciences and whatever else, and philosophy as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think when I started off my mission was to try and combine the philosophy of science and the philosophy of religion in a way. As I work within science and religion, that's my funding, that's my research center. That seemed like, and I have an understanding of philosophy, that seemed like the best way of putting science and religion together. But the more I looked into Kuhn, the more I realized, hang on, people aren't answering these questions. I think everyone has, about understanding that is, everyone has a heuristic. They have something, an answer they would give to the question of what does it mean to understand, but they don't, when pressed, have a way of exploring that in anything like the depth we have for other mental attitudes. There's whole fields, philosophies of emotion, epistemology, obviously, dealing with belief and knowledge, that have been around for 100 years or more in various different forms across different disciplines in philosophy and neuroscience. But understanding is one that slipped through the cracks. I think it's interesting. People are happy to use it, but very unhappy to define it in a way. I find this to be fascinating, and in a way see myself as being quite privileged to be able to look at that and try and clarify that.
Well, I think we could convincingly argue, based off of our other presentations at this conference, that understanding one another and different religions and different belief systems is key and possibly the foundation to a genuine interreligious dialogue and empathy for our other humans. So it's wonderful that we are starting to explore, well, then what exactly is understanding? What does it mean to understand others? My question is, though, this is something I'm still not quite clear on. What is the difference between epistemology and your field of science, your field of study of understanding?
It's interesting. I think there are epistemologists and theorists of knowledge who have identified understanding as being a subset of knowledge. Particularly Jonathan Kvanvig and Linda Zagzebski have mentioned understanding before, and have, in a chapter or two of works they've created, have attempted to clarify that most mysterious of mental attitudes. I think my keenness to differentiate the two, I think certainly the philosophy of understanding could fit into epistemology in the future. But if we are to advance the dialogue, I think there's a need to get away from the temptation of pretending it's another type of knowledge. I think that knowledge by its nature, and I cover this when talking of the idea of understanding as a whole and understanding as subjective and how that differs from knowledge. Knowledge plays into this logical positivist view of the world, the view of the world where it can be broken down into, well, A, if A, then B. It can be broken down into causality and inference, which I think a lot of philosophers, as well as scientists and mathematicians, would like the world to be, but I just don't believe that's the case. I think there is more to it. And so I think my want to separate the philosophy of understanding from epistemology is involved in that want to separate understanding from knowledge. I think it has been wrongly identified as a sibling of knowledge when really it's a different faculty. Interestingly, there's a book called The Master and His Emissary by neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist. And the book discusses the difference between the left hemisphere and right hemisphere of our brain. And his thesis is that the current state of intellectual fields has been weighted too heavily by the left hemisphere. It has been too concerned with rationality and not concerned enough with things which don't quite play into that propositional nature. And he identifies that as being a function of the right brain hemisphere based on various neuroscientific studies. And in his words, he would say that separating it out from knowledge is important if we want to give back the primacy of the right hemisphere, if we want to give it back this idea of seeing the world as an interconnected network, not as islands of individual facts about the world. And I think that for me is why I'm keen to separate it out from epistemology as traditionally defined as the theory of knowledge.
Okay. So if I'm understanding correctly, you're trying to argue that epistemology is the data, if you will, and the accumulation of the data, the acquiring of that data, but understanding is more of the larger paradigm, putting the data together in maybe narrative form, if you will.
I think that's a very good way of describing it. I think it's interesting. Epistemology, of course, is a large and varied field that has been around for a long time, and not all of it still keeps up this propositional attitude that was born in the early part of the 20th century. There's an evolution happening, and of course, as with all academic fields, things do change. I just think so. It's not like I'm saying that understanding can't be put in the bracket of epistemology in the future, but I think as it currently stands, there is this unfortunate association of the field of epistemology with this propositional knowledge-based attitude, which continues to sort of crop up, especially maybe because our current working model of knowledge is a model of knowledge involving knowledge as justified true belief, and that itself involves truth conditions and beliefs which are very propositional in nature.
Okay, that's interesting. And before we get to Dr. Giles's question, he's got a question in the chat box. I want to probe this a little bit more.
Sure, certainly.
As you're aware, cognitive distortions, psychological variables come into play in epistemology and in understanding our perception of the world and of reality. oftentimes a distortion of the input stimuli that's being transmitted to our brains. For instance, we can easily trick our brains into seeing colors that don't exist, or objects that don't exist, hearing things that don't exist. Our brains are well adept at creating patterns, right? Patternicity out of white noise. Under recognizing these distortions, growing number of epistemologists are recognizing that the data out there that we're seeing may not actually be the data that is actually there ontologically. So understanding that, recognizing this, would you argue that understanding precedes epistemology or comes after? And what I'm thinking of specifically is something like a confirmation bias, where we know we develop a belief system instinctually, like that, and then go search for the data to confirm our belief system. In a way, I kind of wonder, is understanding taking place first?
I think that's a very, I see.
And
Sorry,
then
I didn't mean to cut you off.
the data. No, please go on. What do you think?
I see where you're going with that. And I think it's something I've actually thought about myself. There's an interesting word that's used in the philosophy of psychology and in neuroscience, which is the word mental, or the phrase mental representation. One of my methods I like to use, and I think it pays great service to anyone starting out in any philosophical investigation, is to consider the etymology. Representation, of course, breaks down into presentation and the repetitive prefix re, meaning it has already been done. And that's very interesting. When we talk about mental representations, what we're saying is that we are seeing it, and then our brain is showing it to us again. And that's very interesting. To go back to what McGilchrist was saying, he believes that the right hemisphere of the brain, this hemisphere which is famously non-logical, creative, it sees relationships between things, and it's more concerned with the kind of less rigid view of reality. It's often considered the emotional side, even though that's a bit simplistic. Neuroscientifically, that's actually what processes the world first. The world is first processed by this right hemisphere, which has many links to understanding. The right hemisphere is what deals with our subjective impression of the world. It's what deals with wholes and not atoms. And it's what deals with our feelings of what we know. Only then do signals get consolidated within the corpus, pass on the corpus callosum and become consolidated in the left hemisphere, and then shown back to our right hemisphere for kind of redigestion. And that process of showing back to the right hemisphere is representation, how we represent the information to our mind that's already seen it. So I think what you're alluding to is very interesting. And I do think that understanding is primary in that sense, because I think the first thing we see is a much more personal view of the world. We see something as a subject in the sort of phenomenological term. We are a being that experiences. And the first thing we get is that right brain, that right hemisphere hit of that subjective seeing of patterns and the pareidolia and these strange things. And only then does it get digested in linguistic, atomistic, propositional terms by the left side of our brain and passed back over. I mentioned these neuroscientific things not so much as a direct truth of sort of brain reductionism, but simply as an interesting analogy and thought. So I think understanding, in a way, I would consider it primary. It's primary in the respect, I believe, that it contains part of the subject. And we have to become acquainted with something before we can then distance ourselves from it in rational, sort of that abstract rational belief. But then I think we then, of course, don't ever just think about something once. We think about it many times, and our understanding will develop. So the unsatisfactory answer is kind of both, but I think that understanding probably takes a bit of a primary step above the very rational knowledge.
Well, if what you're saying is correct, and I happen to think it is, and if what you're saying about understanding being needed to be its own field of study, which again, I also agree with you, I think it should be, then it seems to me that we shouldn't say understanding is a subset of epistemology, but maybe the reverse, that epistemology is a subset of understanding. I think about it like this, because what you were touching on, I think is probably dead on. The understanding might take place first. We acquire the data, or we're able to analyze the data, and then we actually go back to the understanding step to process the data. Uh, I liken it to this, and let me get your opinion on this analogy. I think about films, film production. When we are video recording something on our cell phone, what is actually taking place is just a series of rapid pictures, right? It's not actually capturing the movements, it's capturing thousands of still moments. Our brain then takes the still pictures and fills in the gaps. I kind of wonder, is that exactly what's happening with understanding in a lot of ways? After the data collection part, which is the rapid fire succession of still moments, the final phase is going back to the understanding, which ended up filling in the gaps between the data, which aren't exactly connected, because data is standalone stuff, right? Object effects are just standalone things. We put the understand with the interpretation and the relationships to it. What do you think about that analogy?
I think that's a very interesting analogy, and that idea of the eye as a camera is something which is fascinating from a philosophy of mind point of view, a phenomenological point of view, wherein a good chunk of everything we see is not actually there, but it's just filled in with our brain. It happens, of course, with language as well. A common thing to do in early psychology classes for students is to make them read a piece of paper that only contains the first and last letters of every word. And you can read it astonishingly fast because your brain doesn't actually read the whole word. It just reads 2 letters or 3 letters and then fills in the gaps in the middle, at least in a neurotypical brain, someone without dyslexia, for example. And that's a similar thing. It's our understanding of the world as it already is the first thing that kind of jumps to fill in the gaps. And then that is kind of retroactively informed once we've processed that information. So I think there's a synthesis going on. I think understanding is both the first port of call for information. It's kind of digesting an objective world and making it human flavored. It's making it so that we can see it. And we know, for example, in phenomena such as pareidolia, where the human brain loves to see faces because we are a face-seeking social animal. That's the sort of that's the human flavoring, if you will. The first thing we see, understanding's immediately in there and says, no, you should look for friends or something. Then we break it down. And then I think it would be foolish to deny that understanding is then also affected by that propositional information, the data that has gone on. There is their representation. And so I like that analogy a lot. And I think it serves a great function in seeing the distinction between the subjective and the objective as well. If we just consider the objective, what the light hitting our rods and cones in the back of our eye, then we're left with a much patchier version of reality that's blurry and stop motion. Whereas when the subjective is added in, we end up with fluid reality.
Interesting. Let me turn now to Dr. Giles, who's in attendance here. And if you will open up your chat box, you can see his question. I'm going to read it out loud while you read it to yourself for our attendance. It says, thank you for opening up this can of worms. I appreciate how you set up the problem of understanding in terms of paradigms, worldviews, and the subjectivity of understanding. But he says, I'm still unclear how you see these two elements interacting, how the internal interacts with the external, and how you see this applying specifically to interreligious dialogue. He says, I think you have a good start, but something is missing. What's your response to this? And take your time to think.
Yeah, I'll just take my time to think about this for a second. So I think my mentioning of paradigms and worldviews, I think in the terms of the purpose of my talk, it was intended very much as a jumping off point. I think what is relevant to the interreligious conversation is that element of paradigms and worldviews where really they are a subspecies of understanding, I believe. I see a worldview, how we view the world, is a flavor of understanding. There are different understandings. Some understandings are about things that aren't in the world, such as emotional understandings, how we understand love, for example, or happiness. So a worldview, I think, is a flavor of understanding. In terms of uniting those two elements, I think it's tough for me to say exactly at this juncture how much further I will go into my studies of Kuhn. I see the sort of philosophy of science and Kuhn's history of science very much as a jumping off point. And unfortunately, I think that the work on subjectivity, which I find so interesting, and its relationship to understanding, was squandered by Kuhn. He ended up spending the remainder of his career talking about, well, basically fixing problems with the structure of scientific revolutions. It caused a huge storm in the scientific world, and a lot of people were attacking him philosophically. So I think, unfortunately, the rest of his career was devoted in large part, I think about 5 major publications, to correcting himself. So maybe we lost out on that element. Relating the two together, I'm unsure at this juncture. I would say I found great interest reading the work of Paul Feyerabend, who is in many ways a student in the school of Kuhn. He took Kuhn and said, this stuff about scientific revolutions, this is too conservative. I want to make this more radical. And he focused quite a lot on subjectivity and said that there is no such thing as objectivity in science at all. It's all just subjective understanding. And there's no real objective data. So uniting those two things together is something I'm still working on. And I don't think you're wrong to point out that something seems missing. But it's something I'm continuing to study, and I do find interesting works quite often around it.
Well, let me ask Dr. Giles's question in another way.
Okay.
Your discussion on understanding is very internalized, as it should be. How does this apply to interreligious dialogue? How can we use your study of understanding to collaboration between the religions? What's the application?
The application, I believe, is fundamental. In many ways, philosophy, if we look at the history of the word, it comes from the Greek philosophia, meaning to love wisdom. And wisdom, as defined by Aristotle, is defined as a knowledge of the base causes and principles of the universe. It's one of the mental virtues in the Nicomachean Ethics. I think philosophy then serves I think philosophy then serves the function of understanding and exploring our fundamentals. And I think that my work on understanding can be applied to interreligious dialogue in that case, because as I said in my presentation, the purpose of interreligious dialogue is the sharing of different understandings. And to share an understanding correctly, I believe we must explore what it means to understand the world in a particular way. So I think the purpose of my work in an application to interreligious dialogue, primarily it's the fundamentals, outlining what we mean about an understanding. And then in the pragmatic sense, in how this relates to interreligious dialogue in the practical, everyday, maybe even applied theological sense. As we study understanding and learn about its attributes, we can learn better, I believe, how to transfer understanding between individuals. I touched on this with the aspect of the subjectivity of understanding, meaning that we have to be okay with the fact that we cannot directly inject our understanding into others' minds. Understanding the subjectivity of understanding forces us, I think, to accept that we have to get clever with analogy, with ways of explaining ideas to people who have a completely alternate subjective experience. And that, I think, is a pragmatic side of my research. From the fundamental, from the abstract and philosophical notion of the subjectivity of understanding, we end up with the pragmatic notion of methods of teaching and education, the ideas of ways in which we draw people's minds to a particular form of understanding.
Well, and this has always been the thorn in every philosopher and epistemologist's side. The discussions that we oftentimes have are very cerebral, very cognitive. They're up in the clouds. And so for us, we love it because it's academic, because it is it's an intellectual exercise. We love to go, well, what is understanding? But trying to get that down to the ground level of what does this have to do with anything? Something maybe just as a suggestion we ought to look at then is instead of recognizing this just as fundamentals in a philosophical sense, we need to also recognize that this might have a neuroscience. You bring in neuroscience. And what I mean by that is a neuroscientist looks at the brain and says, how is the brain functioning and interpreting data? Somebody might go, so what then? who cares if you you understand the difference between the right and left hemisphere of the brain? The neuroscientists will rightly say, well, because once I know how the brain works, then I can figure out how to make it work better, or when some people's brains don't work at all, or whatever else, right? That, I think, is the pragmatic side in many ways for your field. Once we understand understanding, then we can influence people's understanding. And I don't mean in a malicious and coercive way. I mean, if we were to sit down with fanatical and radicalized groups who just do not understand maybe our perspective, a progressivist's perspective.
I think that's, oh, sorry.
Well, we can, if we understand how understanding works, then maybe we can help others grasp information better.
Absolutely. So that's absolutely what I'm getting to with that notion of, I only mentioned, of course, the one type, but I'm fascinated by education generally. And not simply education in the sense of I am someone who is currently in the process of one, but in the sense of education as a skill and an art form. The education is ultimately the transferal of understanding to people from all different backgrounds and different ages, separated in terms of development and things like that. So yes, I think there are fantastic practical benefits for education and for, like you say, I mean, intervention in radicalism or extremism. Absolutely, talking to those who have such a set subjective worldview. Once an understanding of understanding comes about, these things can be explored. And as you've quite rightly put it, and very well phrased it, I think that is the benefit of my research to interreligious dialogue. You have to lay down those foundations to better inform the process of pragmatic discourse.
Now, before we get to Dr. Marconi's question, we'll take a look at the chat box here, because Dr. Giles has two follow-ups. He says, to follow up, I recommend you look into the notion of worldviews in pragmatism, for example, because there's a lot of work that has been done that talks about how our worldview is an interactive process of internal understanding and phenomena from the external world. And I think it's an excellent recommendation as well. He says, and my suggestion on how it relates to dialogue is how communication can be a sharing of worldviews and literarily a sharing of worlds between people. Not a criticism, he says, because he thinks you're definitely onto something, but branch it out even further, which I think is wonderful. And I'm so glad that these seasoned doctors are pouring into an up-and-coming scholar like yourself. Let me turn now to Dr. Valerio Marconi's statement in the Q&A.
Absolutely.
He writes, Pierce once wrote, quote, by intellectus or understanding, I understand the meaning of any representation in any kind of cognition, virtual, symbolic, or whatever it may be. So he asks you, does that sound helpful to you at all? He says, let's not forget that Pierce claimed that we cannot think without signs. And Dr. Marconi, I may ask you to kind of clarify a little bit here, because I'm not sure I understand what the context that Pierce was discussing about. And if you will allow me, Dr. Marconi, I've given you the option to be able to speak. If you're willing to do so, you feel free to speak and kind of give us a little bit of context on what you're.
Please. Okay, so the context is in his Harvard lectures on pragmatism, and he was basically starting with a quotation from Aristotle. And it was about basically that intellect cannot work without imagination and sensibility. And Peirce basically subscribing this perspective, but he was formulating a new definition of intellect. So rather than intellect as a virtue, he was understanding intellect in terms of the meaning of a representation. So the meaning we attach to our representation in a cognitive process. So I think that this can be interesting to you, because being inside, understanding, standing inside. So it's, this process which has to do with representation and with science, with representative elements, but at the same time, it happens inside a cognition, even if, according to Peirce, cognition is not just in a strong relationship, dialectical relationship with the external element.
I think it's a very interesting point, and I find a couple of things interesting in that quote from Peirce, which I hadn't come across before. It's the first time I've read it, and I appreciate your breakdown of it. That's very helpful. The first thing I pull up is that there is a transcription there of, I believe it's intellectus as understanding, a translation there. And intellectus is, it's interesting. There are a lot in the Nicomachean Ethics in book 6. That's where Aristotle outlines the mental virtues, he calls them, which is, I believe it's 7, different forms of virtue relating to intelligence. And intellectus is one that gets batted around, but there are others that relate to wisdom, which I think are perhaps slightly better targets for a translation of understanding. Representation is something I've been looking into because it has, unfortunately, a history of being used in a sense which makes it the antithesis of what I am trying to get at with understanding. It plays into the hands of those who wish to define knowledge as define understanding as a subset of knowledge, in that representation tends to be a very propositional, atomistic construction of reality. They take it as, you can represent in a model, for example, scientifically, and also represent in our minds, which some people are happy to say is just the scientific models of consciousness. I think what's interesting about Peirce's quote, which unfortunately has, there we go, it's in the answer box. I'll just read over it one more time. I think perhaps it, for my purpose, is too broad. I think it crosses into other mental attitudes. And while I wouldn't be able to say what they are right now, talking of ascribing meaning to representation, that's certainly true. But where that comes in the process of cognition and representation, I'm uncertain whether or not it is a sort of lateral understanding that gets placed onto data. And much more, I believe, in the camp of thinking that our understanding shapes it at the outset. It changes what we perceive, not simply what meaning we ascribe to those perceptions. So I can't go that way as to exploring that too deeply, but I hope that has been of some sort of intrigue.
And Dr. Marconi, do you have any response to what was just said?
Not in particular, but I appreciate the suggestion of connecting your understanding of understanding to wisdom, so to phronesis, which is more a contextual engagement with the reality and situations. So of course, if you take understanding in terms of phronesis, this can be helpful also to get something from pragmatism.
Interesting. Yeah, I think wisdom is probably the way to go with this, and exploring that relationship and how that's been translated across time and language. I think is something I'm interested in looking into for the remainder of a year or so of what preliminary research I'm doing at the minute.
Wonderful. Well, Dominic, I am very impressed, very pleased with this presentation. Thank you so much for doing this. I think we learned a lot. And I also want to say, Dr. Marconi and Dr. Giles, thank you so much for your input as well.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Greatly helpful. I'm excited to hear how this pans out and where this goes and some of the new insights. So please keep us updated at GCRR. I definitely want to, I want to know the trajectories. I want to know some of the conclusions. And if any wild or interesting discoveries happen, I think it would be powerful, because this isn't just for interreligious dialogue. As a fundamental, understanding is across the board, politics, religion, you name it. So the implications are huge. So please keep us updated.
I will do.
I want to say thank you to everybody who did attend today. I appreciate you coming out and supporting us. We do have a few more presentations, so I hope I see you later on. And Mr. McGann, I will give you the final word.
Thank you very much for attending, everyone who has, and for your fantastic questions and input. One of my favorite aspects of a conference is just how stimulating they can be to my ideas. So I really appreciate that active participation. Just as a final note, if at any point you wanted to contact me for citations, maybe on things that were in my presentation, or just a general chat about these conversations that maybe you couldn't open today, please feel free to take down my details as they appear on this slide currently. My email address is just dominic.mcgann@exeter.ox.ac.uk. And I will be available on there most times. But other than that, thank you so much for attending today, and I really appreciate the time.